Uncle Joe. And of course then they brought Grandma with them because their father had died and they only had their mom there. So they brought Grandma with them. And Grandma is buried at the Blaine Cemetery in Bridgeport.
How old was your father when he came over?
They weren't much more than 9 or 10 years old when they came over. They were young.
How old was Uncle Ferris?
He would be about 5 years old, say 15 years old, 14, 15, 16 years old. And then, of course, there was no such a thing as child labor. They were able to find work. This uncle of ours from Zanesville had come over, and he was the one that had brought Uncle Ferris on his first trip over. And then the second trip was when he brought Grandma, my grandma, and my father and my Uncle Joe. And they settled in New York for quite a while. They had a lingerie establishment. After things sort of progressed a while, and after talking with Uncle Charlie and them, Uncle Charlie Nader, while they were in New York, they lived in Brooklyn, Uncle Joe was salesman for the company, and he would take trips to all through the states trying to sell their merchandise. But they often took a lot of merchandise over into Cuba, and my father usually did that. And there they would work and do the embroidering and all that filigree work on this material, and they would bring it back and sell it. It was lingerie. This Mr. Ferris, Gus Ferris, that was his last name, but my uncle was Uncle Ferris, which was spelt differently. Nevertheless, they remained in New York quite a while, but we have a cousin whom we call Uncle George. He was first cousin to my uncles and to my father, and they were raised like brothers. There were the 2 boys in that family and the 3 boys in my father's family, and they were raised like brothers. So when Uncle George asked them to come to Bridgeport, I think during the time that they were in New York, I believe there was a time when they had to give out scrip. Money was very, very tight, and they used scrip as a means of paying. It was an unusual thing, and I think because of this may have caused or helped them to think that perhaps they should go elsewhere. And when Uncle George asked them to come to our area, my father and my Uncle Ferris established a business in South Belair. Their first rent receipt was dated in 1901 in Bel Air. That was their first rent receipt, and that was in South Belair. Many a fond memory there, many a heartache there with the floods and everything. And I remember them, even at the time of the floods, carrying me out. Of course, they'd take us in to show us what it was like and everything, and then carrying us out the back way, because there is an incline on that street there, and the water did not affect the back until later than it did in the front. But nevertheless, Uncle Ferris and my father established a business in Bel Air. But Uncle Joe went to Newark, Ohio, and he and Aunt Jo had a business there. But eventually, well, that was Newark, Ohio. But they didn't remain there too many years. They came to the area where my father and where Uncle Ferris were, and instead of staying in Bel Air, they located in Glencoe, which was maybe 12, 15 miles, I would say, west of Bel Air. And they opened what they called at that time a general store. In other words, they had what they called dry goods, which meant clothing, material for the yard, or anything like that on the one, and shoes and clothing on the one side of the store, and on the other side of the store was the groceries and the hay feed for the horses and what have you and so forth, all these things. But it was an interesting time, and I remember us growing. I remember Uncle Joe coming in with the horse and buggy, taking us for a ride. That's quite a few years back. Taking us for a ride, and then eventually they bought a Chevy, and it was traveling back and forth by automobile. And in fact, my mother saw the first automobile that came to Bel Air. Now, when they were married, when my mother and father got married, my mother came over. She had known my father over in Lebanon. Her mother had died. She had helped raise her brothers, and her father had remarried, and she had a half-sister. So at this time, she was ready to come to America. And once again, Uncle Charlie brought a group of about 10 or 12 women back with him from Lebanon. And they all came through Ellis Island.
Did they know English when they came, both your
No,
mother and your
they
father?
did not. But Uncle Charlie Nader, knew the English language. He had been here and had established a business, and he knew English enough to get them through. And God loved them. You wonder, and you are amazed at what they learned, how they learned to keep records in their stores, how they were able to add, how they were able to multiply. I don't think they had more than 5th grade schooling. Now, and Uncle Ferris and my dad, I think, only had 3rd grade. And it's amazing. But as I recall my dad, when we had opened the service station, the gasoline station, my dad could take fractions, 56 5/8 times 43 2/8, and do it faster than you can do it on a computer or an adding machine or anything. He was absolutely a whiz when it came to figures. And I remember as we were growing, when I was about in the 6th grade, George, of course, was older. This was my oldest brother, and he was older than I, and he had started prior to my starting. And on weekends, we spent our weekends in the store making out the checks to the various companies and the amounts that were due them, and we would mark on the invoice the date and the check number by which it was paid, and the only thing we didn't do was sign the checks, because whichever brother signed all those checks wrote Sargus Brothers by Ferris, or now my father went by his first name was Habib Francis, so he always went by H. Frank Sargus, and you will see most of his papers written that way. The H was for Habib, H-A-B-I-B, and of course Sargus is written Americanized, S-A-R-G-U-S. I do believe that it may have been S-A-R-K-I-S or K-U-S, S-A-R-K-U-S, but it was softened into a G, and somehow that is what they took on. Now,
Okay, this is Sunday, September 29th, 1991, and we're picking up where we left off yesterday when Idele was telling us about growing up in South Bel Air in the First Ward, and talked about opening the store. The first receipts were 1901, and she talked about going to seeing the floods and going out the back door up the incline. And Elizabeth was about to ask about her brothers and sisters.
What order were they in, from oldest to youngest?
the oldest was Uncle George, my brother George. I'm second, then Edmund, then your grandfather, and Uncle Joseph. Charles, I left Charles out. We have your grandfather, then Father Charles, and then Joseph. there were the 5 boys and myself. So that makes up our family. And we've had quite a diverse life, diverse lives. By that I mean we've all gone our own ways. Some have married, some have not. Some, Father Charles went to the seminary, and it's really been exciting. There isn't one day of my life that I would change, even till now.
Everybody grew up in the same house in South Belair?
In South
Until
Belair.
you moved up to...
When my mother and father were first married, they lived on what is known as 23rd Street in South Belair. And George and I were born there. But Edmund and Mel were born at 19th Street. We had moved back toward the hillside and away from the lower lands near the floods, up back toward the hillside. And Edmund and Mel were born at the 19th Street house, which was on the southwest side of 19th. Then we moved from that side to the northwest side. And in that house, Charles and Joseph were born. And we lived down in South Belair all those years until we moved up to where we are living now. And
Why did you move?
Oh, I'd say 30-some years ago. We've been up in this house 30 or more years, 30-some odd years. And it was so convenient for them to get to work and so on. Now, George and Edmund graduated from Notre Dame. Mel graduated from Ohio State and NYU. He didn't graduate from Ohio, he went to Ohio State because these were the years of the Depression when your grandfather. And Charles also went to Ohio State. And he was at Ohio State for 2 years. And in the 2 years, he had changed his major. Every year, he would change his major. And finally, at the end of the 2nd year, he come home, and I can hear him saying, "I think I'm going to disappoint you again, Mother. I just don't feel that this is my vocation. I want to go to the seminary." So she said, "It's your life. What you want is what I want, as long as it's for your good." And so the following year, he entered. In the meantime, he had attended dances and had a good time, had girlfriends and was going here and there. But believe it or not, while he was at Ohio State, he found himself sort of helping people to get some of the students to get their feet on the ground, to know who they were and what they were, and that was unusual. But this, I believe, all led him toward finding his own vocation.
Where did he go to the seminary then?
So then he went to the seminary in Columbus. And while he was in Columbus studying, on 2 occasions he became very, very ill. And the second time that he was so ill and was rushed to the hospital, and of course they notified us and we went out, and the first thing I can recall him saying to Mother was, "I don't know, Mom, maybe this isn't my vocation either." So this was his last year there at Columbus, and she said, "Well, if it isn't, it may not be, but let's just do it this way. Finish the year, get your degree, and pray that you will make the right decision." And his classmates helped him with the subjects that he lost out on by being sick. So, as it goes, he remained, and he did pray. He said he prayed very hard, and he found that that was his vocation, and he went on. But he had been so ill so many times and pulled out, he thought, well, maybe I am in the wrong field. Maybe this isn't supposed to be my life. But nevertheless, I can just see the wisdom of my mother's words. Complete this year as if you're to get your degree, and be sure and pray very hard and decide what you want. And so that was it.
Let's go back to South Belair and First Ward. Everybody went to the same grade school?
We all went,
We remember
Well,
seeing
now,
that. We drove past it not too
the
long ago.
first and second grades, there was a school just close, very close to us. And my mother refrained from sending me to the first grade at St. John's. We were such a distance. We were about 1.5 miles to 2 miles, not quite 2 miles, away from school. So she felt that I should be, maybe for the 1 year, down at the school near us, the Blair School. So I went down there, and we had some lovely teachers, and the family got, but now my brother George went to the first grade to St. John's because our neighbor, John Fabry, took him under his wing, saw that he got to school and everything. But for me, after we had moved to 19th Street, she felt it was better. I had no one to take me, and they didn't drive.
Yeah.
So it was better for that first year. But the second year, when I was in the second grade and from there on, but we all went to St. John's, even though some of us may have had 1 year down at the school near us, the Blair City School. And they were wonderful. We had some wonderful friends and wonderful teachers there too. They were really wonderful. But we will never forget the nuns, having the nuns. And they were allowed to crack our hands every once in a while and to bring us in line. And I know your grandfather, when he was in the 8th grade, somebody had done something to one of the other students, and they immediately blamed Mel. And of course, Mel wouldn't tell who did it, so Sister was very aggravated, and she made it a point to call the family. So the neighbor across the street from us said, "Mr. Sargus, it wasn't Mel. He didn't do it. He didn't do anything." But nevertheless, so Dad thought, well, the best thing for me to do was to go and see the nuns. So he did. And he said to her, "Well, if he's causing you that many problems, and it's such a problem child, I think I'll just take him out of school and send him over to the boys' school in Wheeling." And right away, "Oh no, Mr. Sargus, don't do that. Don't do that." And of course, Mel could never make a 90 in the 8th grade because anything that was done was his fault. But nevertheless, he got through it. He did real well. So the following year, he goes over to, we didn't have the 4-year course at St. John's, and so they all wanted to go on to college, and so you had to have a 4-year high school course before you could go in to get your preparatory courses and so on. But there he goes. There's 2 classes of freshmen. They were so large. I think there was maybe 60 in his class and 60 in the other class of freshmen. He was elected president of his class. There he was. I think there were maybe 2 or 3 from Bel Air that were there. All the others, really strangers. There he was, elected president of his class. And when he got his grades, the first quarter, nothing below 93. Nothing. So what did I do? I brought his report card over and showed it to Sister. Because we just felt badly. And all through high school, and of course in college also.
What was the name of the school in Wheeling?
At that time, it was Central Catholic High School. Now, when my brother George went there, it was a military school. They wore uniforms. But when Edmund and Mel went there, it was just but it was only for boys. The girls went to St. Joseph Academy and the boys went to Central, no, it was it wasn't St. Joseph, it was Cathedral High. It was Cathedral High and the girls went to St. Joseph Academy, but I never did. I stayed in Bel Air. I took
And
the
went to St.
so-called,
John's.
the St. John's in Bel Air, took the so-called 2-year course, and then as they kept developing and going into the 4-year course, all the new subjects that were brought in, I took them to get my high school course so as to be able to go on with my music. Of course, I didn't go 4 years to college, but I did go and take my music. But in the meantime, at the high school, I was studying music under one of the nuns, and we had music anywhere from 6 to 8 hours a day, every Saturday, every weekend. We concentrated on nothing but music.
When did you start playing the piano?
I didn't start till I was in about the 5th grade. That was rather late. But George had taken the violin, but finances, you know. But nevertheless, they insisted, and I took lessons, and I wouldn't take until I had a piano, because I wasn't going to go over to the convent and try to practice after school and miss out on things. So they said, well, if you will take them, we'll see that you have the piano. So they bought me a piano, and I took the lessons and enjoyed it. And Sister Lucy was fantastic, and she was the one that encouraged me to go on into music, and I've never been sorry before, but because of it. She was fantastic as a teacher.
And go ahead.
Getting back to your parents, you said your father came from Lebanon. Where did your mother come from?
They were both from Lebanon. The village was known as the Enabi. We spelled E-N-N-A-B-E-E. That may not be the correct spelling, but from the Enabi. And I had the privilege of going back there. Uncle Joe took me over there, and it was really a privilege to get. And of course, Father Charles took Grandma, my mother, rather, back on a trip too. And they went over all the part of the country that she knew and visited her relatives and everything too.
When did she go back? After the war?
It seems to, oh yes, it seems to me it was between 60 and 65. And then she felt like, well, maybe she had always said she would never go back by ship. When they came from Lebanon, it took them 45 days.
Wow.
45 days. They stopped in Marseille, then they come on into Ellis Island, and by the time they got in, and she always said, well, she would never go back that way. So when she and Father Charles left, to drive them to Pittsburgh to get their plane, to land in New York and wait for their transatlantic plane, and to start their trip, and to get to Beirut, and then to get up to her home in Lebanon, which is about maybe 10 miles away from Beirut, up in the mountains. It took them 24 hours.
Quite a difference.
What a contrast.
Wow.
And my mother just took the ride like everything. Father Charles got a little wheezy, but he enjoyed it. And he wanted to see where her father, the church that her father took care of, St. Albert's, and where they went to Mass, and he offered Mass there. And they went to the various places. Now, do you have anything else you would?
What do you remember most about your mother?
Well, about my mother, she left, she had 3 brothers and a half-sister. When her mother died, she helped raise, well, she raised her brothers. She was the oldest in the family, and she raised them. And then her dad married again. And that's when I think things were good. And of course, over there, even when my father and my mother, they didn't have religious freedom or anything over there. And they were under the Turkish rule. Then eventually they became part of Britain, or France. And then it wasn't until about 1922 before they came a country of their own. And once again now they're being absorbed by Syria. I don't know what's going to happen. But that country over there, I can hear my mother telling me, was the only country in all the Mideast there where Christianity prevailed. All the other was Muslim, the Turks, and all the other religions. And she said it was the only place where the people really tried to keep their religion. And it became very, very difficult. And that's why she was rather eager to come, because it was hard at the time for them to practice their religion and to do, and her father had to be very careful when he would go to the church and the things that they would do. But Mother came over with a group of women, group of girls they were, and they maintained their friendship all through the year. They almost felt like family. And her brothers, one brother settled in Westernport, very near to, right across the river from Kaiser, West Virginia. They were very near to Cumberland. And another brother was in New Mexico for Uncle Charlie, and then were in New Mexico for quite a few years. And then they came to Zanesville, and Uncle Massive and Aunt Martha came to Zanesville. And her other brother died in this country during that terrible epidemic of flu. Now that was in the early 1900s. I forget what year that was, Uncle Raymond, and he died then. And she had the three brothers, and the stepsister, the half-sister, Aunt Rose, was only 60 days old when my mother left there. And when she went back and got to see Aunt Rose was in her 60s. So it was really something. But she never forgot that, flying back 24 hours, whereas it took her 45 to come. Now, do you remember Martha Karam and Renee?
No.
Those are all my mother's family. You know,
They're in Zanesville.
some are in Dayton. Renee and them are in Dayton. And even Martha has moved from Zanesville to Dayton. And then Uncle Charlie, my mother's brother, not Uncle Charlie Nader, but Uncle Charlie Manser's family is in Zanesville. That's Raymond and Albert and Angel and the children.
What do you think your mother would say if she was living about the hostages in Lebanon today?
She would be heartbroken. She would just be heartbroken, and to see what's happened over there. But of course, they knew that all through the history of Lebanon, there's been turmoil. Syria has always wanted it, and then from the south, Israel has come in. But Syria at one time owned all that property, or not all that land rather, and they're really dominating it now. There's no two ways about it. They're dominating it now, and I just feel that it won't be known as that. It won't be a Christian country much longer. In fact, I don't think it is now.
After you finished St. John's and with your music training, what music training did you have after that?
I went to St. Louis for sessions, and I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and I went to Nazareth College, and it was fantastic. And it was nothing but music every day and every day, and music and music and music. And as a side thought, when I was in high school, while I was trying to take those last 2 years of high school, as each new subject was added, I was teaching them with Sister Lucy at St. John's. I was only 15, but I was teaching then. So I was getting my internship as I was getting my high school, and she had us so prepared that when we went to Nazareth and went to Washington University, it was like a review.
Oh, great.
It was terrific. So that's why, over the years as I taught, if any of my students were going to major in music, I would always give them at least that first semester, that when they got in there, it wasn't such a great change, and they knew the answers practically. And I don't know how many of my students have returned to tell me that it was just a wonderful opportunity for them, and how confident they felt and how good they felt.
When did you stop teaching music and piano?
Pardon?
When did you stop teaching music and piano?
I would say about, let's see, age. What I did, Elizabeth, as each child graduated from high school, I didn't replace. So it was, I would say it was around the 76, I was 76 years old, I mean, not in 70. Let me see, that would be about 6 years ago. It hasn't been too long, because I kept the students that were going to, that intended to major, I saw them through high school. And then by the time I went through that, my class just dwindled out, and I didn't do any replacing. I never had to advertise for students. Never, in all the years that I taught.
Well, how did they come to you?
Word of mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Word of mouth. I had taught in the school, that is with Sister Lucy and them at the school, and those children got to knowing me, and as I branched out and went into my own field, because Sister then had others that she was training, and then of course she left Bel Air, and that didn't go on after Sister Lucy left. But I never had to advertise for a student. And I always had more than I could tell. And then I taught in Bel Air, I taught down at Dorsey's. The children from Bel Air High School would get to come over for their lessons on their study periods.
What's the first memory you have of charging? How much did it cost to take a piano lesson when you were teaching at 15 or something? Pardon?
50 cents a
Wow.
lesson. There was a young girl living next door to us, Nina Sanovica, who was a delight. It was a delight to have her come for her lessons, because she